Good morning. The Commerce, Science, Transportation Subcommittee on Oceans, Atmospheres, Fisheries, and the Coast Guard will come to order. Today we are here to discuss the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA's, Blue Economy Initiative, and I want to thank Admiral Gallaudet, the Acting Administrator and Assistant Secretary for NOAA, for being here. This initiative is focused on increasing the economic contribution of the United States exclusive economic zone and Great Lakes over the next decade, or in other words, the economy related to our oceans and the Great Lakes. The U.S. EEZ extends out 200 nautical miles from our shores, covering some 3.5 million square nautical miles of water that are home to diverse ecosystems and vast natural resources, including fish, energy and minerals, transportation, and much, much more. A full third of the EEZ, more than any other state, extends from Alaska's 33,904 miles of shoreline. That's more shoreline than the rest of the lower 48 states combined. In Alaska, the ocean economy accounts for 21% of the state's total gross domestic product, generating over $3 billion a year in wages. We are the nation's largest employer in the living resource sector of our oceans. The Seafood and Fisheries Department, where I like to say Alaska constitutes the superpower of seafood for America. Over 50% of all seafood, commercial, recreational, subsistence harvested in America comes from Alaska. Also, we are the nation's second largest contributor in the offshore mineral extraction sector, and like many states represented here, Alaska's natural beauty attracts more than 2 million visitors each year, half of which come by the cruise ship industry. NOAA plays a critical and central role in managing ocean resources and in providing environmental observations to Americans who make a living from the oceans. And again, it's great to have the acting NOAA administrator, Admiral Gallaudet, who's no stranger to the ocean, having served 32 years in the Navy, culminating his military career as the oceanographer of the Navy and the commander of the Navy Meteorology and Oceanography Command. He holds a master's and doctoral degrees in oceanography and has served in NOAA in his current capacity since his confirmation in October 2017. The United States is often viewed as having the best managed and healthiest fisheries in the world through the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act, which we are working on a reauthorization in this committee. And if you've ever seen The Deadliest Catch, you know that Alaska's Bering Sea can be unforgiving, and fishermen rely on accurate weather forecasts from NOAA to stay safe. So this is a broad-based initiative that I think is going to impact many states, and we're looking, I'm glad to have so many of my colleagues here. One of the other areas that I know NOAA is focused on is that through foreign trade, America's seaports are critical to our overall economy. NOAA provides the nautical charts that mariners use to safely navigate and also provide real data on environmental conditions that help get ships in and out of port safely. Many of the nautical charts in my state on Alaska's coasts are woefully outdated and rely on surveys conducted in the early 1900s. Over 100 years old. Many of those measurements came from throwing a weighted rope over the side of a ship. Can you imagine our mariners are still relying on charts based on measurements that came from a weighted rope? We are hoping your initiative, Admiral, can help with that. Given the importance of the oceans to our overall economy in the United States, it only makes sense that we as a nation coordinate our use of oceans and coastal areas in an efficient manner. Last year, I had the opportunity of chairing this subcommittee to hear stakeholders' perspective on the national ocean policy. I'm glad to say that in response to that hearing and concerns, the Trump administration and the President signed an executive order regarding ocean policy to advance economic security and the environmental interests of the United States, which improves public access to marine data and information, improves federal agency coordination, and encourages government engagement with maritime industries, science, and technology. Finally, Admiral, as you know, for the blue economy to thrive, we must make sure we have clean and sustainable oceans. Senator Whitehouse and I had a bill, the Save Our Seas Act, which highlights the challenge of ocean debris, plastics, ocean pollution, in which NOAA will play an increasingly critical role. That passed the Senate, and it's due to pass the House this week. So we are making good progress in a bipartisan way. I very much appreciate your leadership. I think this initiative on the blue economy can bring a bipartisan group of senators together to support you and what you're doing, and I'm glad that you're here to testify on that initiative. I now turn the remarks over to Senator Baldwin, who I know has great interest in this, being a Great Lakes senator. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you. The term blue economy is probably not used very often at Wisconsin dinner tables, but what the term represents is integral to the economies of the 8 Great Lakes states. By surface area, the Great Lakes are the largest freshwater body in the world. They contain 18% of the world's freshwater supply. 35 million people are dependent upon the Great Lakes for their drinking water, and more than 1.5 million jobs are directly connected to the Great Lakes, generating $62 billion in wages. In Wisconsin, we're blessed with water. Both our 2 Great Lakes and our 3rd coast, the Mississippi River, and our 15,000 inland lakes. So it's no surprise then that 1/3 of all registered boaters in the United States reside in the Great Lakes Basin. The last comprehensive report to put a value on Great Lakes boating found that 911,000 boaters spend $2.36 billion per year on trips, $1.44 billion per year on boats, equipment, and supplies, and create 60,000 jobs that contribute $1.77 billion in personal income. Recreational boating can increase the quality of life and the appreciation of the environment for many Americans, and it depends on access to clean, safe water and healthy fisheries and ecosystems. Shipping is also important as an industry for Wisconsin. The St. Lawrence Seaway was completed in 1959, which made it possible for high-quality Wisconsin products to be shipped not only to other Great Lakes ports, but internationally. Now, over 200 million tons of cargo are shipped every year through the Great Lakes. An integral part of the shipping industry is construction and repair of the vessels themselves. In the mid-1830s, the first Wisconsin shipyards opened in Milwaukee and Manitowoc. Nowadays, Fincantieri Marinette Marine in Wisconsin builds Navy ships, Coast Guard ships, and in 2013, the NOAA research vessel Reuben Lasker. In fact, Mr. Chairman, the University of Alaska Fairbanks Regional Research vessel was built at Marinette Marine. There's an opportunity to expand our domestic shipbuilding industry, and I hope that all of my colleagues can support my Made in America Shipbuilding Act to do just that. And finally, Great Lakes commercial, recreational, and tribal fisheries are collectively valued at more than $7 billion annually and support more than 75,000 jobs. But the economic viability of the blue economy hangs in the balance. Pollution, invasive species, harmful algal blooms, and climate change are bad for business in Wisconsin. And while I'm always happy to highlight the ways in which the Great Lakes support Wisconsin jobs, this administration has taken several steps that undermine that very same economic prosperity. From budget proposals that would slash the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to recently released NOAA documents that suggest climate change won't be a top priority for the agency. I'm concerned, Admiral Gallaudet, while I appreciate that you have stated publicly that NOAA's mission statement will not be revised, it's troubling to me that this proposal was ever presented to the department because it threatens to undermine the blue economy. Since 1900, average temperatures in the Great Lakes have increased by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. While we still get our cold and snowy winters, that's a troubling trend, and in recent years, we've seen Wisconsin's iconic cross-country ski race, the Birkebinder, canceled for lack of snow. Without snow for the skiers and snowmobilers, a lot of the tourism traffic in the winter season heads somewhere else. The warmer summers are also causing economic impacts, contributing to more algal blooms that clog waterways and close Wisconsin beaches in the summer. The lake levels seemed to peak in the 1980s and have now fallen, possibly because of higher temperatures increased the evaporation rates. And if NOAA is in fact shifting its focus from climate science, management, and stewardship of our Great Lakes resources, as the slide deck you presented last month indicates, that does not bode well for Wisconsin's blue economy and the jobs that depend on it. I look forward to your testimony, and I hope you will take the opportunity to address those concerns.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin, and we are honored to have the ranking member of the full Commerce Committee, Senator Nelson, whose state of Florida knows a little bit about the blue economy. And Senator Nelson, the floor is yours for an opening statement as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's of interest that all the senators here indeed have coastline. Obviously, Senator Schatz has a lot of coastline. So does Senator Markey, and so does Senator Peters, as well as Senator Baldwin. Now, you said you have more coastline in Alaska than any other state, Mr. Chairman. Is that correct?
More than the rest of all the states in the lower 48 combined.
I see. Mr. Chairman, how many beaches do you have?
Not many, not as many as you.
Well, obviously, that's why we don't just call it a blue economy in Florida. We call it the economy. Our vast coastline, which is mostly beaches, pristine environment, and abundant fisheries are among the pillars of the state's economy. It's a multi-billion-dollar tourism industry, commercial, recreational fishing, and marine manufacturing. All of that is inextricably connected to the health of our waters. And that's why when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened, it really messed up. The winds brought the oil east from Louisiana as far east as northwest Florida beaches. It blackened the white sand beaches of Pensacola. That photograph went around the world, and the guests stopped coming for an entire year because, not just on Pensacola Beach, but they thought all the beaches on the Gulf Coast, in fact, were tarred with oil. And they stopped coming. And it's why we have an economy that when you start diverting fresh water from the river of grass, the Florida Everglades, it's really messed up the estuaries. It's hurt businesses exposed to toxic algae blooms when you release nutrient-laden water instead of the cleansed water that the river of grass would cleanse before it ever got to what is now the Everglades National Park. And also, the blue economy is being threatened by the trade war. Mr. Chairman, we have a lot of people in Florida who depend on industries who are getting hit by the trade war. I visited a boat manufacturer, and we have a major boat manufacturing business in Florida. I visited this Correct Craft boat manufacturer. One of their famous boats is the ski boat Nautique. And when I visited them, they pointed out that 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum, that's bad enough. But now there's retaliatory tariffs. There's a 10% retaliatory tariff from Canada, where they sell a lot of boats, 15% from Mexico, and lo and behold, 25% retaliatory tariff from the European Union, of which Florida boat manufacturers, indeed American boat manufacturers, I imagine you have some of them, Senator Peters, in your state, they can't sell to Europe anymore because the price is automatically bumped 25% with the retaliatory tariff. And so they're up creek and they can't get their boats launched. I heard many companies involved in the manufacturing process. It's not just the boat manufacturers. It's like Power Pole of Tampa and Engel Coolers of Jupiter. And it's like Marine Metal Products and 13 Fishing of Clearwater. And it's like Costa del Mar sunglasses, you know, the famous sunglasses Costas. They're really getting hurt. They sell a lot of sunglasses that cut out those ultraviolet rays out there on the water to an abundant recreational fishing industry. All of these people up and down the line of the economic chain are getting hit. And how about hardworking lobstermen? How about it, Senator Markey? Do you know we have lobsters in Florida as well? And of course, Maine, New England, and Massachusetts have a lot of lobsters. Well, it's forced prices down because of the global demand for lobsters to drop. The president's tariffs are causing this global demand to drop, forcing the prices down to $5 or $6 a pound from what was $12 a pound. That may be welcome news for consumers, but it's damaging to your fishermen and to our fishermen who rely on the global markets to make a living and provide for their families. And so, from lobster fishermen to boat manufacturers, to the cooler manufacturers, to the sunglass manufacturers, it's staggering if it happens that those that are being laid off, and that is what is happening, people are getting laid off. They're feeling the pain, and this is all coming from a trade war. And it's no wonder that so many companies are worried if they're going to get crushed by the trade war. It is bad for the blue economy, the subject of this hearing. And so I'm grateful that you're holding this hearing. When it comes to discussing the blue economy, you can't do it without talking about the trade war and how it's going to definitely affect folks' livelihoods. And so who better to be here to talk to us than Admiral Gallaudet as the Acting Assistant Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Admiral, you have 5 minutes for your opening statement. Again, we're pleased that you're here. Thank you for your leadership on this issue. And a longer written statement can be submitted for the record if you so desire. The floor is yours.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss NOAA's support to the blue economy. I want to thank you, Chairman Sullivan, for hosting this hearing. Alaska is a key contributor to the U.S. ocean economy through fishing, shipping, tourism, and energy. I look forward to discussing how we can grow these sectors to benefit Alaska and the entire nation. Coastal regions are home to 40% of the U.S. population and contribute $320 billion to our GDP. Recognizing this, the President issued a proclamation in June that commits the nation to harness the vast resources of our exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, by deploying new technologies from American innovators, streamlining regulations to promote economic growth, and protecting our marine environment for current and future generations. The administration intends to advance America's economic security and environmental interests. Singled out as critical in this proclamation are NOAA's activities to support the blue economy, including exploration, mapping, and surveying of our nation's waters, and employment of advanced observational technologies and forecasting capabilities. This work is one of NOAA's two major priorities. The other priority is to lead the world in weather forecasting, which will greatly benefit the coast and the heartland by more accurate storm warnings that protect lives and property, and improved seasonal predictions that help farmers and ranchers make better water management decisions. Key to NOAA's blue economy work is promoting U.S. seafood production. This includes advancing fisheries science and reducing unnecessary regulations on our commercial fishermen so that they can maximize their sustainable yields. We are also working to end the importation of illegal, unreported, and unregulated seafood to level the playing field for U.S. fishermen, and we are supporting domestic aquaculture. The fact that the U.S. has arguably the largest EEZ in the world, but ranks 17th in worldwide aquaculture production, is unacceptable. We are changing that by executing a strategy to use existing authorities to expand aquaculture in federal waters. We look forward to working with Senator Wicker to clarify the statutory authorities and provide the regulatory certainty required for a robust domestic aquaculture industry. Also important to NOAA's blue economy work is our support for maritime transportation. Secretary Ross highlighted how NOAA improves the efficiency and safety of U.S. seaports in his Senate testimony on infrastructure. 90% of U.S. overseas trade moves through our ports, adding up to $4.6 trillion annually, so that even small improvements in port efficiencies have tremendous economic impact. For instance, NOAA provided a precision navigation capability to the Port of Long Beach, California, where a combination of high-resolution bathymetric surveys and real-time environmental data increased the allowable draft for ships to enter port, enabling them to carry up to $2 million in extra product per foot of draft per transit. With commerce on top of the water and seafood from the water column, there also is value on and under the seabed. NOAA is promoting energy production, mineral extraction, and pharmaceutical development while meeting our statutory obligations to protect the marine environment. One way we are doing this is through ocean exploration. The United States has mapped the Moon and Mars to a better resolution than our seafloor. NOAA is examining ways to expand mapping our EEZ with autonomous vehicles and remote sensing technologies, allowing discovery of new areas with energy and mineral potential, as well as new ecosystems and species with boundless possibilities to benefit human health and understanding. We are also advancing research in underwater acoustics to reduce the uncertainty about the impact of noise on marine mammals. Better knowledge will help protect marine mammals while also facilitating the safe exploration for offshore energy. Lastly, NOAA is ensuring our ocean, coast, and beaches are clean, safe, and productive. We do this by implementing statutes such as the Marine Debris Act, the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which support recreation and tourism by improving our environment and quality of life. Ultimately, a vibrant U.S. economy depends on healthy oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes. The science and management to conserve and sustainably use these resources is at the heart of NOAA's mission. I look forward to answering your questions about how NOAA is promoting the blue economy for the benefit of our great nation.
Well, thank you, Admiral, and again, thank you for being here. Let me begin with some just kind of basic questions that help frame the topic of discussion today and what you've been working on. You know, the U.S. government doesn't have an official definition of the blue economy. Can you share your interpretation of the term in terms of how you frame that, look at it?
Yes, Chairman Sullivan, thank you for the question. We at NOAA view the blue economy, or the aspects that we support, to be being or encompassing areas such as marine transportation and commerce, as well as tourism and recreation and ocean exploration, and of course, fisheries.
Okay, and do you have kind of a ballpark figure in terms of the size of that economy for the United States, and maybe as a percentage of our overall annual GDP?
Yes, Chairman Sullivan. The number that our National Ocean Service was reported was $320 billion, I think, which contributes about, is a percent of our $18 billion GDP.
$1 trillion.
Trillion. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Great. Let me ask another question. I know that you're going to be visiting a number of states in your capacity to discuss stakeholder meetings throughout the country on this and other topics. Looking forward to having you in Alaska soon. Are you? Can you elaborate a little bit more on your visits, not just to my state, but to other states, I think this summer and through the fall?
Yes, Chairman Sullivan, thank you. I look forward to visiting Alaska, Juneau, and Anchorage in August, and that's part of several trips I'm making across the country as part of public listening sessions. And in this, we're asking members of the public to comment and give their feedback on how we're aligning our priorities with the Department of Commerce's vision and strategy.
Are you going to give public notice to, not only communities in Alaska, but to other states that you plan on traveling to?
Yes, Chairman, and I think we put this on the web today, and it will be published in the Federal Register tomorrow.
Okay. Let me ask, we're having our salmon runs back home in my state, which is obviously very important. Some of the runs have been disappointing. Some of the runs have been disastrous, to be perfectly frank. I'd like to get your commitment once the salmon season is done in Alaska to have you and your top officials like Chris Oliver and perhaps some experts from the states like mine and maybe some other Pacific Coast states to have a hearing to kind of get your best sense with regard to what's happening on these runs, why some are strong, why some are weak, why some have been very challenging. These negatively impact my state, the blue economy, my constituents in an enormous way. And there's a real desire to get a handle on the science and what is exactly happening. Can I get your commitment on that as well?
Yes, sir, Chairman Sullivan. You have our commitment to help you in understanding what's happening to salmon and doing the things that will continue to sustainably manage the fisheries in your state and across the country.
Let me throw out a concern that that relates to the last commitment you just made. One of the things that I think we see bipartisan support for on this committee certainly is having the best science and best data available to help you and other federal agencies, but primarily NOAA, bring that to councils like the different Magnuson-Stevens Act councils that manage our fisheries throughout the country so that they can make the best recommendations on fish stocks and sustainability based on science. I see a NOAA budget request that came out that proposes more than a $17 million decrease in NOAA fisheries programs in the fisheries science and management element of NOAA for FY19. If we were to enact these kind of budget figures, which I'm not going to support, wouldn't that undermine the blue economy and the value of our not just commercial fisheries, but recreational fisheries as well? And how do you square that with the initiative, which I support, but it seems like you're not requesting the full amount that I think there's a bipartisan support for in terms of science management of our fisheries?
Chairman Sullivan, I agree with you that fisheries science is very important to sustainably manage our stocks. And
critical.
Absolutely, sir. Critical. And we are committed to continuing our stock assessment work, and I believe in the FY19 request, we are not decreasing funding in stock assessment work, But there is efficiencies we think we can gain through improved monitoring and observations using unmanned systems technology, for example, and electronic monitoring. And so those, I believe, is where we can make some efficiencies, and we've already made great advances in that kind of observational work to date.
Great, okay, thank you. Senator Nelson. Okay, Senator Baldwin.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'd like to submit the slide deck that Admiral Gallaudet presented to the Department of Commerce leadership last month into the record. And I'm also
Without objection.
Thank you. And also like to submit a draft released last month by the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy entitled Science and Technology for America's Oceans, a Decadal Vision.
Without objection.
And I do that so that we can all have context for what I'm about to discuss. In your presentation to the departmental leadership last month, you proposed that the NOAA mission statement and vision either be amended or otherwise reconsidered. And specifically, the presentation included two columns, one labeled past and one labeled present. The past column included references to studying climate in order to realize resilient ecosystems, communities, and economies. The present column does not even use the words climate or resilience. And I think both of these are very important priorities for NOAA. In the Great Lakes, higher than average temperatures and a less predictable climate have the potential to shorten the season for recreational activities, increase the rate and severity of storm and flooding events, and we've seen some enormous extreme events of late, impact shipping routes, threaten certain cold water species, and impact our agriculture, tourism, and maritime industries. Admiral Gallaudet, you said in response that, and I quote, "This presentation is a simplified draft for discussion. It was not intended to create change in the NOAA mission or policy from what it was before," end quote. So what then do these columns, past and present, aim to represent, and why are they labeled past and present?
Thanks for your question, Senator Baldwin. The presentation was deliberative. It had not been cleared through the department, and the purpose of the slide deck and the slides you're talking about in terms of mission were merely to foster discussion on how NOAA is aligning under the department's strategic plan. And so there were elements like aquaculture and weather forecasting, which were singularly present in the strategic plan, and that was the purpose behind the language.
The Decadal Ocean Vision document that I also entered into the record identifies goals to advance U.S. ocean science over the next 10 years. Remarkably, even though citations that include titles of study in the footnotes throughout the document use the term climate change, the plan itself never once uses the phrase. How does NOAA intend and plan to continue to study and address the threats of climate change? And, maybe a more difficult question, how will you make sure that what appears to be glaring omissions of the term climate change don't yield a subtext in which NOAA's internal culture that science, conservation, and management of natural resources are not valued, or worse, should be censored in this administration?
Thank you for your question, Senator Baldwin. As Secretary Ross and I stated publicly after the document hit the press, was that we are committed to NOAA's climate and conservation elements of our mission. And you can see today in FY18, we have $100 million dedicated, or nearly so, to climate research. And we're continuing to perform climate services through our Climate Program Office and Climate Prediction Center. So we are committed to continuing that element of our mission.
Senator Nelson.
Admiral, you retired from the Navy as the chief oceanographer of the Navy, is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
And what is that? Is that Rear Admiral?
I was a Rear Admiral when I retired, yes, sir.
2-star.
I was a 1-star, sir.
Well, your long and distinguished record is certainly admirable, and we appreciate it. And personally, I'm very glad with your background that you are where you are. Now, you answered the question of the chairman's about fishing research when he asked about a 17% cut. You answered it, we are committed to fishing research, but we think we can be more efficient. When Senator Baldwin asked you about climate change and the lack of use of the term climate change, you basically answered that we are committed to studying the climate, and yet the president's budget has a $50 million cut in climate change research. How do you square that?
In the president's budget, Senator, of course, we had to make tough priority calls, and the president elected to prioritize national security funding, and that therefore Commerce and NOAA saw reduced levels in the proposed budget. I will answer to you, though, that we're committed to our climate support and research and advancement through the subseasonal to seasonal forecasting capability or element of it that's called out in the Weather Act.
Well, you just answered that the priorities of national security sometimes trump the other parts of the budget. The specific question here is about climate change, and you are a retired Navy admiral. Does the effects of climate change have any effects on national security?
Senator, yes, sir. I saw that in my career, and I've spoken about the effects of climate change on national security. And in fact, though, I would say, though, that there are many interagency efforts to assess those impacts. And therefore, again, I don't believe that reductions in funding towards that in NOAA are significant in that. The Navy is also committed to studying climate and climate effects on national security, as is the Department of Energy, as is NASA.
I appreciate that, and I'm not going to throw you softballs. I'm going to throw you harder pitches. Give me an example of where climate change would have a direct impact on the United States military with regard to our national security.
I think the thing that I saw that was most obvious was the effects of sea level rise in Norfolk Naval Station, for example, which is experiencing increased levels of high tide flooding, which impact the infrastructure at the base, the airfields, and the piers, and just the accessibility by the sailors to get to their work every day.
Well, with that, I'm going to back off the hardballs because I think you've answered the question about why it ought to be all hands on deck, to use a Navy term, about the issue of climate change. Not just the U.S. military, but the very agency that is tasked with studying the climate, and that's your agency, NOAA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Schatz.
Admiral Gallaudet, thank you for being here. Thank you for your service. I want to talk about coastal resilience. As you know, the 2017 hurricane season, Harvey, Irma, Maria showed incredible damage and resilience activities. Regardless of what we think the cause is and the conversation about weather versus climate and all the rest of it, it just simply makes sense to build more resilient coastal infrastructure. I'm wondering what you're doing in that space.
We're doing quite a bit, Senator, and thank you for the question. You know, our fisheries has an Office of Habitat Restoration, And so I've seen restored marshland in Louisiana, for example. I've stood on areas that restored marsh that was underwater for decades, and that is now serving as an effective storm barrier for New Orleans.
So I want to stop you right there because this actually gets to my second question. And again, there's a kind of way you can talk about this that's going to freak people out if they don't self-identify as environmentalists. But here's the way I would describe it. We like to call it ecosystem services, but the other way to look at it is if you destroy coastal ecosystems, then what you end up having to do as a city or a town is essentially levy taxes to reconstitute those services that the ecosystem provides. Fresh water, flood abatement, even parks and recreation. You get rid of it, and then you end up building it back, but it doesn't work as well, and it costs you a heck of a lot more. Is that consistent with NOAA's view of ecosystem management?
Senator, yes, sir, it is. And our National Ocean Service, I believe, has performed a study about the economic contributions and gains made by investments in coastal resilience.
I want to ask you about a 2016 study by the Department of Commerce, which valued the gross sales and receipts from recreational fishing and boating at around $38 billion. And if we could count the indirect effects like jobs, tourism, travel, the figure would be even higher. This is a significant and growing part of the blue economy. I think more people enjoying and appreciating our oceans and coasts is a good thing because people are willing to take care of the things that they love and that they enjoy. What are you doing to support this growing industry? I know there's been a lot of talk about extractive industries, fisheries and minerals and other natural resources. Less talk about recreational boating and fishing. I'd like you to talk about what you're doing in that space.
Yes, Senator, thank you very much. That's something I personally am interested in. I'm a recreational boater and fisherman and live on the coast in the Chesapeake Bay. And so NOAA is doing great work to support tourism and recreation. For example, we have our national marine sanctuaries, which provide for $8 billion of economic activity every year. And that you see in our sanctuaries, much activity devoted towards fishing, recreation, scuba diving, and just enjoying the coastlines. We also have great programs like our marine debris program, working to remove marine debris, plastics, not only offshore but ashore on beaches and coastlines, just because the citizens don't want to recreate in trashy areas. And so that program, I think, is doing great things in that area as well. And I'd say also our weather forecasting through the National Weather Service is also supporting the safe conduct of recreation and tourism in our coast.
Let's talk a little bit about surf forecasts. They're important for safety. They're also important for recreation. Forbes magazine is projecting around a $13 billion value for the international surf industry. We can't find any specific data for just the United States, but I want you to talk a little bit about getting better fidelity on surf reports and the surf industry more generally.
Yes, sir, Senator, I'd be glad to. In fact, I've been really pleased to look at the improvements made in our coastal models. We have large-scale global ocean models and wave models, and then what they call nest down into very localized, high-resolution coastal models, and we have them for regions all around the country. The newest one we established was for the Gulf of Maine, but we're making great improvements through science and technology advancements, through modeling improvements. And what we're encouraged to do is, as you cite, is share that technology with the private sector and encourage the growth of those kinds of industries like Surfline and as we have done already with the private weather enterprise.
Thank you.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you for calling this important meeting, particularly related to the Great Lakes. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Admiral Gallaudet, I understand that on your trip around the country, as you're visiting various locations, you're going to have the opportunity to, or at least planning to do some scuba diving in the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary in Michigan in mid-August. And I appreciate your kind invitation for me to join you. I'm not going to be able to join you on this trip, although just I guess it was about 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to be with our friends in NOAA and dive on some incredible wrecks. As you know, the Great Lakes and its fresh water just perfectly preserves these wrecks. We have over 100 wrecks in the sanctuary. It is some of the most incredible scuba diving you'll do anywhere. So folks who are listening to this, please come to Michigan and visit us, because it's part of the blue economy, to come there to be able to experience that. And I think my friends in Alpena will tell you what this sanctuary has meant for the area. It has been an incredible driver for the economy as people have not only come to dive, but on the glass-bottom boats. There is a visitor center that NOAA has that is world-class, that explains the heritage, the shipping, the nautical heritage, maritime heritage of the Great Lakes that built America as it traversed. So it's a very important part of the blue economy. And that's why my question to you, sir, is why has NOAA proposed to reduce the budget for sanctuaries and marine protected areas in fiscal 19? And specifically, what kind of impact is this going to have on Thunder Bay and other marine sanctuaries?
Well, Senator, thank you for your question. And my goal is to decorate my office with underwater photos just like yours in Thunder Bay. We think the impacts to the sanctuaries of those budget cuts are going to be minimal, and that we're able to absorb them and still manage our sanctuaries in a fine way, as we have been for years, over 2 decades. And in fact, we are seeking to secure potentially expansions in our sanctuary system, as well as 2 possibly new sanctuaries over the next coming period. One is in Mallows Bay in the Potomac, and we're working with the state of Maryland on that. And I think that's a great example of how each sanctuary is sort of tailored to each local economy and community's interests, and so as to foster the great things that you've seen in Alpena through Thunder Bay.
Well, still, these cuts will have an impact, and especially when you look at zeroing out coastal zone management grants, sea grant programs. This is cumulative. We know these are economic drivers. These grants are important, and the growth continues. In fact, in the Thunder Bay example, they are undergoing research that they believe will find another 100 wrecks. This will continue to be an economic boom. These cutbacks have an impact, particularly in conjunction with these other programs. Don't you agree?
I agree. They have an impact, Senator, and we understand that the work funded by or done at the sanctuaries and the coastal zone management programs is important. Again, our prioritization in the 19 budget was for core government services, and so external grants to states and local entities were at a lower priority. It's important work, and we are happy in FY18, for example, we did see appropriations for coastal zone management, and we've been able to do good work in executing, I think, $75 million of funding towards those efforts this year.
I'd also like to follow up on a long-standing concern for our state and region, and that's the administration's proposed review of all sanctuaries and maritime national monuments. Straightforward question for you. Do you support maintaining the existing boundaries of the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary?
Sir, I know that the administration has sought to explore and examine the expansions that have occurred over the last few years, and I agree that we need to assess continuously how well and to what purposes our existing sanctuaries and monument systems serve the public, as well as the economic contributions they make.
Well, I hope you have a discussion when you're up in Alpena with folks about the importance of those boundaries and how that is part of the blue economy in that part of northern Michigan. To keep that is going to be critically important. I hope you have that discussion. I'd also like to ask you a bit about NOAA's oil spill prevention and response efforts. As you know, NOAA is tasked with updating environmental sensitivity index maps, which help summarize the coastal resources that are a risk of oil spills. So we had a very large oil spill in Michigan, in fact, the largest pipeline break in history a few years ago. We have a lot of concerns related to Line 5, which is in the Straits of Mackinac. In fact, a recent report came out to show it'd be a multi-billion-dollar effort to clean up that kind of spill should it occur. And while the maps in the East, West, and Gulf Coast have been updated within the last 5 years, it has been over 20 years since NOAA maps were updated in the Great Lakes. Why has NOAA not updated the environmental sensitivity maps in the Great Lakes for so long?
Senator, I'll have to take that for the record. I don't know the reason for being slow on the Great Lakes and not so in existing areas. I can comment and say, though, that we have a restoration and response office in our National Ocean Service, which does fantastic work responding to spills every week. And they're all around the country in the Great Lakes as well as every coast, doing very good work, and I'm proud of their efforts.
Well, I'd like to enlist your efforts to make sure we get these maps done, particularly with a concern that we have related to a pipeline now that exists in what the University of Michigan has characterized as the most dangerous place anywhere in the Great Lakes Basin for an oil spill. And so having sensitivity maps will be incredibly important as we try to work through issues related to that. I've introduced actually legislation with Senator Young, who's a member of this committee, to require that NOAA update the Great Lakes coastal maps at least once every 7 years, which I think is appropriate. And our goal is to provide better, more actionable information. I hope to get your support as we move that bill forward.
Well, thank you, Senator. We'll look hard at that, and as I said, I'll get back to you on explaining why the delay.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, welcome. The United States imports over 90% of all the seafood that we eat, and that amounts to a huge trade deficit. This seafood largely comes from countries who do not have laws like the United States that create sustainability, managed fisheries, such as Thailand. Many Americans understand that they can support local sustainable fisheries by buying from American fishermen, but seafood fraud, the fraudulent labeling of fish products, undermines these efforts and contributes to our seafood trade deficit. This isn't just a case of one fish or two fish marketed as a red fish or blue fish. There have been multiple investigations finding systemic seafood fraud. In 2011, the Boston Globe did an investigation and collected fish from 134 restaurants, grocery stores, and seafood markets. After conducting DNA testing, they found that 48% of fish were sold with the wrong species name. More recently, in 2018, we've learned from Associated Press investigations that companies continue to label farm seafood as wild-caught and sell fish that is out of season and illegal to catch. NOAA and its Office of Law Enforcement is responsible for monitoring fisheries and protecting the public by prosecuting seafood fraud. Admiral Gallaudet, let me give you the numbers. In June, I requested information from NOAA, and this morning I received an answer. In the last 5 years, NOAA's Office of Law Enforcement has initiated 114 investigations related to seafood fraud, 24 of which were referred for prosecution. There are currently 30 active investigations. Do you believe that NOAA has enough resources for its Office of Law Enforcement in order to do this job, given the pervasive nature of fraudulent seafood being sold in the United States?
Senator Markey, thank you for your question, and the answer is yes, I do. I believe that our Office of Law Enforcement, who are all fine public servants, by the way, do great work and can handle the work by partnerships with state entities as well as foreign partners and interagency partners such as the Navy and Coast Guard.
So you think you have adequate resources in order to detect and prosecute?
Yes, Senator, I do.
Well, we have to encourage the purchase of domestically caught wild fish over fish from foreign fish farms, and that's why I am keeping a close eye on the Office of Law Enforcement and the progress of NOAA's new seafood import monitoring program. Senator Wicker and I worked with NOAA to create this program, which provides transparency and traceability for certain imported seafood products to prevent illegal, unreported, and unregulated seafood from entering the U.S. Administrator Gallaudet, can you give us an update on how the implementation of NOAA's traceability rule is going?
Yes, Senator, I can. In fact, the seafood import and monitoring program has been active since the beginning of the year, and we're currently executing those activities on a little over a dozen species. And we've added to the FY18 omnibus added abalone and shrimp to that, which will double the amount of seafood that we have been monitoring and inspecting, and that will be in place by the end of the year.
Okay, thank you. Back in April, 10 of my Senate colleagues and myself, we sent a letter asking NOAA to do a comparability study of Canada and the United States marine mammal conservation standards. Our concern is obviously about the right whale. Could you commit to giving us the results of the comparability study by September 15th of this year?
Senator Markey, yes, as we discussed yesterday, we will get you the answers there of that study of comparability with Canada by September.
Okay, thank you. And that is very important. Now, on the question of drilling off of the coastline of the United States, I have been very concerned about the still lack of full implementation of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill recommendations. The Department of Interior is proposing a rollback of offshore drilling safety rule. Secretary Zinke is actually moving forward on that. My view, and this is right at the heart of this issue, is that for New England, it really makes no sense for us to be talking about drilling off of our coastline when fishing and tourism are the lifeblood of our economy, and any oil spill would have devastating consequences already on an already existing economy. What is the plan from your perspective that would be best in order to ensure that New England does not suffer from an oil drilling program that ultimately could result in a spill?
Well, from NOAA's perspective, Senator, I think the currently new national ocean policy that the President has put into effect through executive order provides the mechanisms, I think, to mitigate the unwanted consequences through the planning and data aspects that the policy provides for. So ensuring that siting takes into account multiple uses or potentially competing uses and being informed by the best science and data. And that's what the policy provides for. And I think that's something that we can use to mitigate the concerns you have, sir.
Well, do you think it makes any sense to be rolling back the safety protections that were implemented after the accident down in the Gulf of Mexico?
Senator, I'm not sure what you mean by safety protections, but we are committed to the things that we're responsible for, such as implementing the Marine Mammal Protection Act and Endangered Species Act.
Okay, so you don't want to see them rolled back, is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, sir.
Well, again, we're talking about comments made by Secretary Zinke with regard to rolling back.
I will state, though, sir, that we are supportive of the administration's desire to be a leader in global energy.
Okay, good. I appreciate that, but we in New England, we're in a situation where we would run all the risks and get very little of the benefits. That is, we are not an oil or natural gas economy. We're an economy of tourism and fishing. So, so that's the concern that we have, and we want to make sure that all the offshore drilling safety rules, the well control rules are all at the strongest possible level in order to protect our economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Admiral, I want to actually follow up on a line of questioning Senator Markey was just discussing with you on the topic of fisheries, and I applaud his focus on the issue of seafood fraud and how it impacts our fisheries negatively and adds to the trade deficit, which I know Secretary Ross has been very focused on, and we appreciate that. I understand that NOAA is working on an initiative to promote the production and competitiveness of U.S. seafood. I applaud this work, and I know it comes directly from the top. As I mentioned, Secretary of Commerce is very interested in that. Can you give us a little bit more information or details on this initiative that you are working on with the Secretary?
Yes, Chairman Sullivan, thank you. The initiative and the efforts we're undertaking today involve, as you said, addressing the $16 billion seafood trade deficit that exists. And so one element is fostering the increase of domestic aquaculture industry in federal waters, and also providing support and science to aquaculture in state waters. So that promoting that industry is one element that we are underway with right now, and we intend to expand to some degree. The other thing we're working with is to look for ways to expand market access for our seafood producers. And that's a pretty exciting element, I think, and has opportunity, especially as we are in the Department of Commerce. And then, and lastly, it's optimizing our fisheries in a sustainable fashion. And that, as I mentioned earlier, we are improving our stock assessment models as well as the data behind them, so that we can really maximize the sustainable yields of our commercial fishermen around the country. And so those three efforts we're underway with, and we think we'll really be able to make a dent in the seafood trade deficit and really foster seafood competitiveness.
Let me probe a little bit more here. I know that NOAA is not a marketing agency, but making U.S. seafood competitive also means making it a priority choice of consumers. I think most consumers would agree that wild-caught salmon or wild-caught lobster is preferable to farm-raised. How can NOAA build and improve on the Fish Watch program to help educate U.S. consumers on the benefits, the health, sustainability of U.S. seafood, particularly wild-caught seafood?
The Fish Watch program is an excellent one. And in fact, what we're working with is the network of aquariums that exist around the country as an outreach vehicle to talk about seafood competitiveness within the country and ultimately abroad in terms of exports.
When you talk about exports, I do want to just mention, as Senator Nelson did, growing concern that we have with regard to the potential for trade retaliation. As you know, Alaska is a major seafood exporter. I know that the President's goal here is certainly to open markets in China and in other countries where he sees non-reciprocal trading treatment. I actually happen to agree with that, particularly as it relates to China. The economic and trade relationship is very non-reciprocal, that favors China, and we need to do something about that. I appreciate his efforts, although I have raised with him and with Secretary Ross the concerns I have about the retaliation hitting the major exporters in the seafood area, and that's, of course, a lot of Alaska fishermen. Is NOAA doing anything to analyze the effects of this retaliation on U.S. seafood prices and exports and competitiveness, which, again, I know is a priority of the Secretary and yours? Are you doing anything in that area?
Well, thank you, Chairman Sullivan. We do continually study exports and of the seafood industry, as well as imports and their effectiveness. And in fact, encouragingly, we did see an increase of about 4.7% over the last year of our seafood exports, and actually more than double that, 10.7% of the value of U.S. seafood exports. So we do track that. I don't have any data now in terms of the impacts of the tariffs, but I will say we support the administration's agenda with respect to trade because our competitors have outclassed us and had an advantage in the past by not being free and fair in their trade policies.
Let me end with a topic I touched on, and I know it's part of the Blue Economy Initiative, but it goes to hydrographic surveying. Senator Peters raised it as an issue with regard to the Great Lakes, and so you see it as a concern, not just for tourism and commercial activity, but for preventing ships from running aground. As I mentioned in my opening comments, in the Arctic, we are woefully inadequate in terms of the maps, surveys. Senator Peters mentioned being surveyed once every 6 or 7 years in the Great Lakes. As I mentioned, there's parts of Alaska that have never been surveyed, ever, and some of the other areas haven't been surveyed in over 100 years, where, let's face it, the technology wasn't very cutting edge back then. What are you doing to prioritize updating nautical charts in the Arctic, particularly given the vast expansion of commercial activity in transportation and fishing in that part of the world and that part of America.
Thank you, Chairman Sullivan. We're doing great work in our Office of Coast Survey in Alaska and across the country in terms of trying to map perform hydrographic surveys of our EEZ with the goal to complete that by 2030. And in Alaska specifically, we're both using our ships, the Fairweather, and also the unmanned technology I talked about before. And we are using these unmanned surface drones, for example, for the first time to collect bathymetric information. So we have a plan, a national charting plan, and we're executing that.
So your strategies at NOAA to pursue the data gaps in Alaska are covering what? And give me a sense, a little bit more of the specifics of the strategy.
Well, again, our goal is to get to the whole U.S. EEZ, including Alaska, by 2030.
So specifics.
In Alaska and in the Gulf Coast and every coast.
But I mean, how are you doing that? Ships, you mentioned,
Yes.
UAVs.
Yes, sir, ships and using unmanned surface drones.
And do you have the funding to do that?
Yes, sir, we are funded for that.
Okay. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. I know our subject here is pretty broad, but obviously, as a region of the country that is greatly affected by our oceans economy, appreciate the fact that we're having this hearing to talk about how critically important it is. I know the chair also mentioned stock assessment, so want to definitely go back to that subject. Our fisheries management is so dependent upon stock assessments. Do you have adequate budget to do the stock assessments that are critical for us to continue to grow this part of our economy?
Yes, Senator, I believe we do have an adequate budget to perform the stock assessments to sustainably manage our fisheries.
You can manage all our fisheries under the current level of funding that you have?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. I find that surprising because most of the things that we've been talking about are issues of not being able to accurately manage the fisheries based on the fact that we haven't done the stock assessments. So, and if you haven't done the stock assessments for a lot of these fisheries, how can we do the science behind the management strategy?
Well, I've visited our fishery science centers in your state, for example, and I've talked to our scientists who are doing this, and we've improved our models, and we've improved our observational capabilities to do these.
Okay, Senator Risch and I have introduced legislation dealing with the Columbia River. Are you in support of that legislation?
Ma'am, I'm not familiar with it. I've been to the Columbia River, and I've talked to the pilots. Not familiar. Is this the sea lion legislation?
Yes.
Oh, I am familiar with it, ma'am, and our staff has worked with both the House and is now working with the Senate.
In support of the legislation, or?
To assist with it, yes, ma'am.
Okay, if you'd give us a solid answer on that legislation, that would be so helpful. What else do we need to do in making sure that the salmon continuation of policies that are going to help us with both our orca population and salmon population? What other additional things should NOAA be doing?
I think it's what you pointed to with stock assessments, ma'am. It's improving our observation technology and the study and science behind it through the fishery science centers in your state.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Baldwin.
So I'm a member of the Senate Great Lakes Task Force, and we work very hard to to protect our shared resource. It's a very strong bipartisan task force. I noted earlier that these lakes provide drinking water for 35 million people. They also contribute billions of dollars in tourism each year and support over 1 million jobs across our region, and they're home to myriad ecosystems. We've discussed a number of issues that could really harm the Great Lakes Basin, from pollution that can foul the drinking water to invasive species that could threaten our fisheries, an oil spill when the lakes are iced over, or harmful algal blooms that plague our beaches in the summer. Admiral Gallaudet, your vision-setting summit presentation includes a proposal to implement 50 deregulatory actions. I am all for cutting red tape and letting our homegrown businesses get to work, but many of these environmental protections actually support the blue economy. The Clean Water Act, the Oil Pollution Act, the Endangered Species Act, and others protect the resources that support Wisconsin industry. So, Admiral, how will you ensure that you aren't rolling back important and common sense environmental protections when you go about this process?
Senator Baldwin, thank you for your concern, and I think that's absolutely valid and important. We are committed to meeting the statutory obligations of the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act and all the others that we are required to do. The deregulatory actions referred to in that brief are more so along the lines of fisheries management. In fact, one example will be, I think, is in the FY18 Omnibus Critical Fish Habitat Amendment, amendment is the right term, which is a deregulatory fisheries management action which will save about $70 million for New England fishermen this year. So that's an example of the actions we're talking about. It's not to meet the mandates of the environmental protection statutes.
Quick question about shipping. According to a 2011 study, maritime commerce in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway supported 227,000 jobs and $33.5 billion in annual business revenue. Specifically, Wisconsin ports support 8,777 direct and indirect jobs, and $1.4 billion in business revenue, handling over 30 million tons of cargo valued at $2.4 billion. Admiral Gallaudet, do your plans to promote efficient seaports capitalize on the ports and maritime commerce resources of Wisconsin?
That's a great question, Senator. I will have to find out for you if any Wisconsin ports are included. I know that we have many ports around the country, including Great Lake ports like Toledo, which will be installing sensor systems next month. So we'll find out for you about Wisconsin, and I hope to give that answer to you by the time I visit September 12th.
Great, thank you.
Part of the listening tour.
Wonderful, thank you.
Admiral, I'm going to ask a few more questions. You've been an outstanding witness here. Senator Cantwell mentioned the issue in her community in the Columbia River on sea lions. One of the issues that I wanted to raise with you is a continuing concern. It's really a concern that's gone on for years with many of my coastal communities and constituents about the negative consequences related to restrictive measures in place with regard to the western stellar sea lion population that, as you know, was listed under the ESA but has had an enormously big recovery. And so there's a number of Alaskans who have been working with your agency conducting a 5-year review of that stock's status, which I think everybody recognizes has dramatically increased. I know you don't have the status of that review off the top of your head today, but at least can you commit to me that you will complete the review in an expeditious manner, incorporating the data from many of Alaskans involved in this, including a lot of our biologists and scientists, so we have a way to look at the possibility of resolving this issue in the future. And this is an issue that I think it's not just Alaska, but I know senior officials in Washington and Oregon have also raised similar concerns about this stock assessment and what to do going forward.
Yes, Chairman Sullivan, we will commit to an expeditious review of the stellar sea lions.
Western stellar sea line.
Western stellar sea line, sir.
It's different from the eastern. It's important. It's important distinction, actually. Let me end with two final questions with regard to the Blue Economy Initiative. Obviously, if we're talking about the economy, we obviously are talking about the private sector. What does NOAA plan to do, either through existing partnership programs or new ones, to help build those relationships between NOAA and the private sector to help have a much more robust and successful Blue Economy Initiative? And do you need any type of funding for that?
Thank you very much, Chairman Sullivan. We think the most opportunity lies in what the National Ocean Policy highlights, and that's the current National Oceanographic Partnership Program, which is a terrific vehicle to bring together the private sector, academia, and the government in terms of, to conduct ocean-related research, which will directly benefit the blue economy. And so we think that's the one vehicle that we would like to see leveraged more in the future.
So that's collaboration with other research institutes, essentially?
Yes and yes, including in industry and academia, as well as our federal partners.
Great.
I think the Navy runs the program.
And then finally, how can this committee work with NOAA on the potential Blue Economy Initiative and legislation to advance our mutual priorities and goals? I believe there is a strong potential for bipartisan legislation that supports many of the goals that NOAA is setting out in your initiative, and I think you saw that demonstrated by the number of senators who participated today and their questions.
Thank you, Chairman. I believe that this committee could do great things for us in advancing the work I described with respect to fisheries, aquaculture, and seafood competitiveness, as well as tourism and recreation, ocean exploration and maritime commerce, all which were discussed, I think, well and solidly in this hearing.
Great. Well, we look forward to working with you on potential legislation as it relates to the blue economy, an area where, again, I think there's bipartisan support and enormous potential to benefit my state, Wisconsin, and our citizens and constituents throughout the country. So thank you again, Admiral. You did a fine job today, I thought, and your team, thank you. And this hearing will be open. The record will be open for the next 2 weeks. So if there's additional questions from any other senators, we would ask that you and your team expeditiously respond to those. And again, we appreciate the hard work you're doing. This hearing is now adjourned.